Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk about FDR and the New Deal. We've already spent our time talking about Hoover and the Great Depression. We talked a little bit about FDR as a man, how he came into office, some of his limitations. Remember, we looked at his past and just talked a little bit about his personality. Remember, FDR and Hoover are contrasted in one idea specifically. Hoover did not believe in direct relief. You should not send money to the people. Roosevelt is going to change that. Remember, Hoover believed in indirect relief. You help corporations, you help companies, and then it trickles down into the economy. FDR is going to come in with a different plan. Help people directly. You're at a time of high unemployment. 1 out of 10 people are out of a job in this COVID thing that we're in. And you also are going to find that our government is both helping corporations and the people directly. Well, this is an outgrowth of this time period. Here we are almost 100 years past, and they're looking back to those ideas. So let's talk about how FDR planned to save America. So he is a politician in a wheelchair. We talked a little bit about how that was hidden from the American public. In 1932, voters still had not seen any improvement, so Hoover's not doing it for them. They want a new president. So the Democrats nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's suave, he's conciliatory. He had been stricken with polio in 1921, which confines his ability to walk. And his wife, Eleanor, will become literally his legs and his eyes. It'll be she who travels the country often to go see things in person and then bring back the news to Roosevelt. If you are interested in the Roosevelts, there is a PBS series on the Roosevelts I highly recommend. It goes all the way from Teddy to Franklin. Very interesting family and a very interesting dynamic in this marriage. So, Hoover is defeated 472 electoral votes to 59. Remember, I told you he was probably one of the most prepared men to be presidents, but it was the times that ruined him. It is a noteworthy transition here. That we begin to see African American voters move from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Now, we'll see that trend start here. We'll see a much larger move. Remember, a lot of African Americans have been disenfranchised, but some have, with the Great Migration and the exodus to the West, they are voting in states. In the South, still they're being disenfranchised. So, Hooverites would later accuse FDR of letting the Depression worsen, so that he could emerge even more shining. Again, I think that's just a criticism to make sure that the Hoovers say, hey, we did all we could do, and FDR didn't do a whole lot, and it got worse, and then it just made it look like he made it better. Here are the 3 R's you need to know. When you talk about this time period, there are 3 R's you need to know. We're going to talk about relief, recovery, and reform. How do we help the people? How do we get back on track? And how do we make sure this never happens again? I need you to really look at that. I would want examples of each of those so that if you have to write about that or bring in outside information in a future essay. FDR has that famous speech. We heard a little bit of it earlier, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He is a cheerleader for America. He calls for a nationwide banking holiday. He closes banks. Remember, independent businesses. He closes them so they have a chance to get their records together, to see how much money they really have on hand, and then the government may come in and help some of them who are struggling. In the first 100 days, they are extremely active legislatively. In the first 100 days, they're going to run all kinds of bills through both the House and the Congress. They're going to come to FDR's desk. They're going to be signed into law. Why? Because they want to show that they're doing something. That 100 days becomes a marker of a president. Whatever the next election holds, about 100 days into a president's time period, there's usually some kind of like, what has he done in the last 100 days? Well, that comes from this issue here with Roosevelt, that idea that you're supposed to get in there and get things done. And they've got to get things done. They've got to show that they're different than Hoover. So they look to Europe and copied a lot of things that were going on there to bring to America. So in these 100 days, what Roosevelt does is he concentrates on relief, recovery, and reform. We've got to get America back to work. And it's got to look like we're doing something to make that happen. So from March of 1933 to June of 1933, remember presidents were not inaugurated until March at this time period. It's going to change because of this event. There are 17 proposals that Roosevelt sends to Congress, and 15 proposals that's sent to Congress, and all 15 are adopted. Imagine that today. A president says, here are my 15 ideas, and Congress grabs them and says, those are great, let's go. Remember, some of these are new congressmen. The Democrats are in charge here. We've got to get this legislation through. We've got to show America we're doing our best. So Congress and the president tried anything reasonable to overcome the Great Depression. Some of these are grasping at straws. Some of these are well thought out. Some of these are still in effect today, and some of them will be unconstitutional once they reach the Supreme Court. So let's look at banking. We have talked about banking in this class a lot. Let's go back and do some review. Remember, we talked about banking with Hamilton and how to set up an economy. We talked about banking with Andrew Jackson. We talked about putting in some kind of national treasury with Polk. We talked about with Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve. And here we are once again talking about banking. In 1933, they put together the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This is going to help banks be funded and stay in business. Hopefully loans can be given out so businesses can be started. People will feel good about their money and put it back in the bank. Take the money that they took out, put it back in the bank. It's there to loan out and to recover the economy. Roosevelt is going to use the radio effectively. He's going to have lots of these fireside chats where he is, in theory, sitting there by the fireside, speaking to you, and you're listening to it on a radio in your own living room, and you feel like he's right there. They're going to secure deposits. Now, most of you have probably seen that little sign as you enter a bank. If not, you'll notice it now, called FDIC, or a bank will have a commercial, and they'll say they are FDIC insured. It means that the federal government is going to stand behind your bank, a private business at this time period. And if you put money in there and the bank goes bankrupt, your money is insured. So that's a new idea. He also is going to take us off the gold standard for a while. Now, we'll be permanently off the gold standard with the Nixon administration, but that's to come. He's going to take it off the gold standard. Why? So they can print lots of money. Basically, they're printing money that's not backed up by a whole lot of things, but they're trying to get money in circulation so it looks like, again, that the economy is doing well. So let's look at farm foreclosures. We've talked a lot about farmers in here. And the impact of farmers, the idea of the yeoman farmer, the idea of the agricultural republic of Thomas Jefferson. We've talked about the populist. Well, here again, we're looking at farm foreclosures. Notice at the peak of the Depression in 33, they're extremely high. We talked about how people were getting kicked off their land and were running around the country trying to find jobs. As New Deal relief comes in, farm foreclosures go down. Now, let's be careful about this. Some of it is there are some farms that have already been foreclosed on. Of the ones that are left, the government is going to come in and try to help those farmers. Why? If America can't eat, America can't exist. And the farmers have been telling us that all along. Notice by World War II, they're way down. And then again, as we head into the war, farmers are going to be making money because they're feeding the world again like they did in World War I. You watched the video on the Dust Bowl, and you saw just how hard farming was in certain parts of the world. This is a list you need to look at. Were we meeting in person? This is a list I would hand you out as a handout. These are called the alphabet agencies. Today, you are familiar with using acronyms for all kinds of things. Well, these are some of the original acronyms that people started using. These stood for things that they were going to do to change America. So I would look at this list. I would look at some of these abbreviations here, be familiar with them because I'm going to use them here in class. They could come up on a future test, and you do have a test on the 20s and 30s coming up, as well as on an AP exam. They might say this document is produced by the AAA or the CCC, and that, again, would be a hint that you know, what time period it comes from. So we're going to help agriculture. We're going to help regular people, the civilian. We're going to build things with the Civil Works. We're going to try to, again, help the economy with the Federal Emergency Relief Act, keep people in their houses. We're going to make sure farms are secure. We're going to loan out money so people will buy homes, because when they buy homes, they're buying things for those homes, electricity and appliances. They are going to try to help to recover the economy, the NRA. We'll talk quite a bit about it. And please notice the NRA. That is the National Recovery Administration. I know today when we hear NRA, we think National Rifle Association, but not for this chapter. They're going to help youth. They're going to help public works. They're going to try to electrify rural America. In this current situation we're in, we've heard a lot about the internet, right? That there are rural places who can't get the internet, so therefore online schooling or working from home has been an issue. Well, it's electricity at this time period. There's still plenty of people, and I'm going to show you some statistics of your own state, where people just didn't have electricity. Social Security, something that, again, was a temporary agency that is still here today. Those are one of the things that we still have left around from the Great Depression. The TVA. You are in Tennessee, those of you who don't know where these lectures are coming from, and many of you live on the lake here in the city that our school's in. Well, that lake didn't exist. Those were valleys. But when the TVA comes in and builds the dams to control flooding and to produce electricity, hydroelectric power, you now have a lake house. It changes where roads go. It changes the topography. And the Tennessee Valley Administration is not just for Tennessee. It affects other states. But what happens when the government gets involved in business? When the government runs electricity? Is this socialism? Is it because you have to buy your electricity? There were private electric companies, but they weren't going out into the rural areas. It wasn't cost effective. Well, what happens when the government does this? And the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. We're going to see quite a bit about them. So let's talk about relief. Ease suffering of the needy. Get relief. In this current crisis we're in, you notice immediately they start printing these checks and mailing them out. Well, there's no system for that, at least at this point, so they've got to work through that. So how are we going to relieve the suffering? Well, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Notice it goes into World War II before it disappears. The Works Progress Administration. It's going to employ 8.5 million workers in construction and other jobs. It's going to provide also work, though, for people on the fringes, like in the arts and the theater and literary projects. It's going to put people back to work. It's not just a handout. It's a job. But it's a government job. It's a government-sponsored job. 8.5 million people go to work for the government. What this is going to allow people to do is continue to take their skill and use it. There are going to be interview projects come out of this. There are going to be recordings of people who were part of historical events. There are going to be people who go in and write the history of communities. You're going to have folks go out and write plays to again, encourage America and to lift our spirits. So here is the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. It is a relief agency. Again, at its peak, more than 3 million people will work there. What are they doing? They're building hospitals. They're building schools. They're building playgrounds. They're building public buildings. Why? Because you're seeing your government doing something in your community. Some of you are from the Gallatin area, and you know the courthouse on the square. That is one of these projects. Some of you know that our state park system is from these projects. Next time you're at a state park, some of them were built by a group called the CCC. We'll look at that more in detail. Some of the downtown buildings are built during this time period. So there's schools that are built during this time period. Why? The government's doing something and you can visually see it. Notice this picture. Now here's what I want you to see. If we were in class, we'd do a little more discussion. Why aren't they using dump trucks? Why aren't they using steam shovels? Because dump trucks and steam shovels employ a few people. This, and look at it, is going to employ a lot of people. It's hand labor. So you see men with wheelbarrows. That means somebody's making wheelbarrows somewhere in America. Someone's making shovels somewhere in America. And these men are going to get a check for working. It's not a handout. They're getting a check for the work that they do. So you want to involve as many people. Is it as efficient? No. Is it uplifting to these people when they get their paycheck? Yes. What will they do with that? They'll go out and spend it in their community. And hopefully that money will begin to circulate and the economy will be better. Here's a great example. Here you have some people building a road or a curb in a town. You can see the town in the background. Well, you have someone sketching this work, right? There's your artist being employed. You have some management there. The guy in kind of the light colored uniform here, or pants and shirt. And you have workers, in this case, interracial, which I find interesting. I don't know if this is a posed picture or whether this is something somebody came upon. You have a photographer taking pictures. You have someone writing about this. And again, you see this in your downtown. You see that the government is changing the landscape so that the roads are better, so that your town is better. The government cares about you. Notice these guys. Notice how many. They're hand digging a sewer line, something they may not have had for their school or for their hospital or for some other public building. Again, it puts people to work. Yes, they're digging a ditch. Could they have used some other instrument for this? Yeah, but that doesn't put as many people to work. Here, guys, working to change the landscape. Notice how many people, how many bodies. Here they are keeping the bank from washing away on a levee. Remember, we've talked about flooding in this class. Again, look at the amount of people working. These people are going to get a check at the end of the week. They're going to get paid. They're going to buy food. They're going to be able to pay their house mortgage. They're going to be able to buy clothes. So, relief is important, the WPA. Well, what about the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps? Remember, we've talked about conservation and the history of that. It kind of ebbs and flows and changes a little bit in its focus. Here's a situation where we're going to take 3 million young men to work in camps. They're going to build bridges. They're going to replant forests. They're going to do other conservation tasks. Now, why? Well, if we were in class, we would discuss this, so let me jump ahead. By taking the young men out of the job market, you provided jobs for the middle-aged family man. By taking these young guys out who might work for less, it's their first job, their first opportunity to work, you take them out of the market. So that means the people left are possibly your middle-aged men with families who need that job. So these guys are going to be taken out. They're going to be fed by the government. They're going to be clothed by the government. They're going to be told what to do by the government. It is some of these same guys who in not too many years will find themselves in the military fighting in the Pacific and the European theater. So let's think about that. You're 18, 19, 20 years old in 1933. You have been told what to do, when to get up, how to spend your money. We'll talk about that in a minute. What to wear by the government. You join the Army. Same thing. In the 1950s, when you come out, World War II is over, you're in corporate America. And the same kind of thing. Someone tells you what to do. There's some kind of dress code. We'll talk about that as we get to the 50s. And so these guys have grown up taking orders their whole life. Well, compare that group of people to what we think of the 60s and the 70s. You've got a group of people who've always believed in the government, always trusted the government. The government has always helped them. The government has always told them what to do, and everything has been fine. In the 60s and 70s, you have a generation who is exactly the opposite. They don't want to be told what to do. They don't believe that the government is helping them. So that's going to be a lot of that culture clash that we're going to see coming up. So just be aware of that. So here's what happens. It exists up until World War II. So they are going to develop job skills. They're going to improve the environment. Our national parks are going to be helped by this. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park, for instance, is one of these projects, as well as, again, in Tennessee, some of our state parks. They're going to remove, again, those surplus workers from cities. And, again, it'll provide a healthy condition for these guys, and they have to send their money back to their families. They're only allowed to keep part of their salary. They have to send the rest back home so that mom or dad or the kids or their brothers and sisters, right, that they can have some food. And again, that money gets spent in the economy. So the CCC, within 4 months, there are 1,300 CCC camps. 300,000 men in 1933 between the ages of 18 and 25. They sign up for 6 months. They make $30 a month. So by 1941, over 3 million men have served in the CCC. Again, some of these guys will just transition right into the military. Their goal, keep the teenage guys off the streets, keep these young men off the streets, give them a job, teach them job skills. Some of you may remember in 2008, we had an economic hiccup in America. And in that hiccup, there was extremely low youth employment. And so a lot of young people did not get those first jobs. They weren't working as cashiers or in a fast food restaurant. Who needed those jobs? Adults. And so it has been harder for some of those folks to work their way into the system because they didn't have those beginning level jobs. Well, this takes these guys, gives them the skills, and then when the economy is better, they'll be ready to go right back into it. So they're going to plant trees, build parks, drain swamps. Florida is going to be changed because of this group. They're going to restock the rivers with fish, right? Flood control. That's going to be a big one here in Tennessee, and we've seen that in the country. All kinds of things that help the environment. Now, not only are they going to be employed, but think of all the paperwork to hire that many people, to house that many people, to feed that many people. Here you can see a bunch of young men signing up for the CCC. Well, who also is getting a job? Secretaries. Remember, this is before the copy machine. So you've got to make multiple reports. Someone's got to actually have a piece of paper. There's no email. There's no phone app. So lots of people, again, are being put to work because of the CCC. And here they are, out working in the sunshine, building up those muscles, becoming productive members of society, learning to take orders, and again, changing their world for the better. They're seeing some results. And again, look at the clothing here. These are guys who, this was their work clothing. This is what they had worn at their other job. So in this case, the government isn't providing the clothing. What are they doing? They're planting trees. There's been a forest fire. You can see the burnt stump here in the foreground, and they're replanting to make sure that a forest grows here again. So also those resources for America in the future. All right, let's continue this idea of relief. How are we going to bring relief to the people? Well, the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Act. Notice that. Federal, the federal government. We talked a lot in here about federal government versus state government. This is a federal program, and its purpose is to bring relief. It's going to send $500 million directly. Are you seeing it there? Directly to unemployed workers. It's going to let them be able to get food and clothing. It's going to give grants to cities. Remember, cities had spent all their tax money. They had tried to keep people employed. They ran out of money. $500 million in those dollars. Today, we just had the stimulus package. What was it, $2 trillion to do that? So again, people are going to get checks. They're hopefully going to go out in the economy and again, get the economy going. So relief. Again, we're still in relief. The HOLC. What is this? The Homeowners Loan Corporation. Let's make sure people can stay in their homes. Let's think about it for a moment. In 2008, we had a crisis when it came to homes and mortgage in America. We had homes that people couldn't afford anymore, so they moved out of them. Well, let's talk about how that affects the economy. Well, those are homes that aren't buying electricity or water from your local government. That's a problem. Those are homes that are sitting there now on the market, which means there's plenty of homes, but again, very few buyers. So the prices of housing are declining, which means when your house is reassessed for taxes, there's less tax money coming in. That also means that people aren't going to Home Depot and Lowe's and buying a mower, or they aren't going to the furniture store and buying furniture, or they're not doing home repair and buying paint and nails and shingles and all the things that come with home ownership. All that disappears from the market. So if you can keep people in their houses, one, it's self-respect, that they have a place to live. And remember, these are multi-generational families living in these homes. Many of you live with just your family. But imagine that you're living in the house there with your mom, your dad, probably more kids than live in your house presently, and maybe a set of grandparents or an uncle or an aunt. Remember, houses have been combined, and again, these larger houses that had multi-families, that wasn't uncommon. So keep people in their house. So this prevented foreclosures. The government bought up the mortgages and refinanced them so people could afford to stay in their house. Well, let's look at where this is happening. When it comes to families on relief in 1933, which states are getting the most relief? Notice the South, that heavy Democratic South. Remember, the Democrats could count on their votes. Notice the Midwest, farmers. And yes, there are states that get less. Your state is one of them. What's going on there? Well, to be honest, Tennessee was already kind of poor before this, and many people did not see a difference when this happened very much in their life. But that's where the government's trying to help. Well, let's talk about recovery. How do we bring the economy back? Now that people have calmed down a little bit, they're going to stay in their house. Their son's going to have a job at the CCC. Money's going to be coming in, maybe not a lot, but a little. Maybe you're going to get on a construction crew. How do we get the big economy going again? Well, here it is. The National Industrial Recovery Act. Industrial. We're going to get America back on track. Now, it gets called the National Recovery Act, so be careful. I know it's confusing. It technically is the NIRA, but it ends up getting the nickname the NRA, right? The National Recovery Act. And it is going to make sure that America is competitive, right? No trust, no monopolies, and that people get a minimum wage, a wage that they can live on. Not a wage that's their first job. Some of you have jobs and you get paid minimum wage. But next time you go somewhere, think about the adults that are working there. That they also are working for minimum wage. And is it really minimum? Is it enough for them to live on? So here's the symbol of the NRA. Notice the Great American Eagle there. Notice that the graphics here look very similar to some things going on in Europe. Notice you've got the idea of the eagle holding the cog of machinery there, right? That gear. And then again, electricity getting things fired up and going again. You would hang this banner in your store window. You put it outside your business to say, we're a part of getting this economy going again. We're paying our workers the right amount of money. We're out there trying to create jobs. Come support us. So it helped businesses organize. It set prices. Yeah, the government's going to say, you can't charge more than this for this idea, for an item. And the reason for that, again, is to try to settle things out, to make people able to afford things. A minimum wage, right? It put people back to work at decent jobs with wages and working conditions, and businesses were not forced to join this. You're not forced to join it. But again, if this symbol is outside your business, people know you're doing what you're supposed to help the economy get better. In 1935, it is going to be declared unconstitutional. So 2 years after it gets going, the court is going to rule it unconstitutional. Why? Because it violates laissez-faire. Now, we've had this discussion in class. We've talked about economics in here. The word laissez-faire is not in the Constitution, but the court sees it in there and says when the government steps into business and tells them, again, what to pay, how to make their goods, and setting prices. Now, they had done this in World War I, and it had not been a problem. But again, those are during times of war. This is not during a time of war. So the Supreme Court, using its power there, is going to declare this unconstitutional. Quite controversial, and is going to make Roosevelt rethink what the court should look like. That's a future discussion. So here we are. Here are things you should buy in August. Why? Because these are their best prices. Right? Soap and macaroni and lima beans and spinach and milk and tea. And you can see some of the prices. Now is the time. Don't get all this money the government's giving you and hold on to it. Get it out in the economy. And we're going to make sure you get the best price and the best value and the most amount of stuff for your money you can. The government presently is mailing stimulus checks. $1,200 per person, $600 per child. What could someone do with that? Well, they can go out and buy stuff. They could pay their rent. They could pay their past debt of things they've already bought, which doesn't really help the economy at all. But here is a situation where they're saying, get out there and buy things. Notice this is the A&P grocery store. And again, they support the NRA. Here's a restaurant letting you know that they too are helping out the cause. That if you eat here, you're helping people who are getting a living wage. Well, what about farmers? Let's not leave them out. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, provided farmers and protected farmers from price drops and overproduction. We've seen this before. Farmers were pouring out their milk. They were burning their crops. Why? Because they couldn't make any money. Well, this is going to guarantee a farmer a certain amount of money for a crop. If you plant something, this is the least you're going to get. So you can kind of do the math and realize, hey, how much of it do I need to plant? How much of it do I need to harvest? Now, again, it's still susceptible to weather. They may be paying a certain amount per bushel of wheat. You may not harvest very much wheat. Maybe it's a drought season. Maybe you got planted late. But at least you know that you're going to get paid this certain amount. That's something you can go to the bank with and say, I've got X number of acres. It ought to produce about this many bushels of wheat. And that means I'm going to be able to pay back this loan. So let me keep my farm, or let me expand my farm, or get a new piece of farm equipment. Again, keeps the economy going. It even paid farmers subsidies. Sometimes it paid farmers not to grow things. And I want you to hear that. It paid you not to do things. Imagine for a moment I have 1,000 acres in a small farm town, and the rest of you guys each have 100 acres. The government may come to me and say, will you not plant this year? Let those small farmers plant. Let us buy from those small farmers, because that's going to put 10 100-acre farms in business, and you're just a one-man, 1,000-acre farm. We're going to pay you not to grow something, and I get a check for that. Guys, there are still subsidies today. There are people who live in New York City, downtown, off Central Park, who own huge amounts of land in the West, and they get a check as a farmer for not letting that land go to agriculture. Why? It lets those other farmers make that money. Again, subsidies. You're going to be paid not to grow crops or produce dairy or make milk or make butter or raise pigs or lambs. The idea is to get the small farmer busy and maybe keep the larger farms out. Doesn't mean you can't grow something else. Maybe they pay me not to grow wheat this year, so I grow soybeans, because that's not a concern. And hopefully, again, it's going to prevent another Dust Bowl. Yes, my farm may be being plowed and planted, but what about all those farms around me, those smaller farms? If they're laying fallow, then again, we're going to have another Dust Bowl situation. Plus, those are 10 families that aren't making money. I'm making money, but those 10 families are going to buy a lot more than I'm going to buy. So that's what they're trying to do here. Remember the Dust Bowl. You've watched a documentary on it. I hope you enjoyed that. We've talked about it a little bit. Here is where it is, and a lot of you learned things about it you were unaware. Recovery. The TVA. Now, this one's personal for us in this part of the country. Some of you may have family members that work for the TVA. When you turned on your light switch this morning, it was coming from TVA. That's where we get our electricity here. One of the things that we forget here in Tennessee is we have cheap electricity. Why do companies, and why have companies moved here since the 1980s? Because of the price of electricity. Why have car companies and manufacturing companies left places like California? It's expensive to buy electricity there. It's cheap here. Now, your parents may complain about what it costs to heat the house or cool the house in the summer and the winter, but comparatively across the country, we have pretty cheap electricity because of this program. So let's look at how the TVA changed your neighborhood. The federal government is going to build a series of dams to prevent flooding, so that's good. Farms won't wash away, communities won't wash away, and to make electricity, hydroelectric power. This is the first public competition with private power industries. I do have a documentary if some of you are interested, and it talks a little bit about how there were already private electric companies. It's not like Nashville didn't have electricity. Or other places in the South didn't have electricity. Now, many rural areas didn't have electricity, but cities did. You often, to run your radio, brought your battery in to have it charged. You swapped it out, kind of like you guys might do a propane tank for your grill. You brought it into town, you got a new battery, and then took that back so your radio wasn't running electricity, it was running on a battery. What happens when the government comes in competition with private industry? Well, the government has a lot of buying power. It buys in bulk. It can control a lot of things. Maybe it's unfair competition. And so people are concerned that this is socialism. Remember, the government is going to own the means of production, and they're going to set the rates, and they're going to decide who gets the electricity. So when I say Tennessee Valley, let's look around. This is not something that's just going to affect Tennessee. It affects Kentucky. It affects Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, right? A little bit of West Virginia, North Carolina, maybe a touch there, Virginia. It's a multi-state project. A multi-state project. The idea is to bring electricity here. Now, one of the pluses is going to be in World War II. In World War II, and we'll get there, we'll talk about the Manhattan Project, the building of the atomic bomb. Some of that is going to be done at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It takes a lot of electricity to work on this project. And because of the 1930s and setting up this system, there was electricity in Tennessee, and a little place that was nothing becomes a major production for the atomic bomb. It was all top secret. There's a great history there, but that cheap electricity. Now, since the 1980s, a lot of car plants have come this way. Why? Well, it's because the way we deal with labor in Tennessee, the right to work state, we've talked about labor, and cheap power. So look at that map for a moment. Some of you may have been to some of these places or know some of these things. When I was growing up, there was going to be a future electronic shortage or electrical shortage. And so TVA was building lots of nuclear power plants. They've actually sold some of those in your lifetime. Why? Because the demand has not been there. Why? We're more electric efficient today. Our houses are better insulated. The things that we use electricity for run better off of it. So there was this large projection. TVA has struggled because they had put a lot of money into construction projects that now they didn't need to build because they're able to keep up with electricity. So the TVA, electricity for all. It's going to be in the South. And guys, we're poor. I mean, you have grown up in a different time and a different place in Tennessee. But that idea of the Tennessean wearing bib overalls and going barefoot and being backwards and kind of hick. Remember, we looked at that with what? We looked at that with the case in Tennessee. Remember when Darwinism was being taught at a school in the Scopes monkey trial, a lot of people had that view of Tennessee in the 1920s, and it was very rural. We still have that concept, maybe with like a show that your parents may have grown up watching called Hee Haw or country music. Still a very rural agrarian area. Well, you know that's not true. You live in a suburb of Nashville. That's our city. We're very much metropolitan today. But again, why do we still have that reputation? Well, let's look. So they're going to stimulate electricity here. It's going to stimulate the economy. When people get electricity, what do? Well, they buy electric light bulbs. They buy electric appliances. It puts people to work. It's going to control flooding. They're going to plant new forests. It's going to really bring this part of the world into the 20th century. Remember when you watched the documentary Flood of 27? How are those people living? Guys, they're still living like it's the 1870s. It's 1927, and they're still living. I mean, the way they do labor, the way they handle people, the way their houses are done. So let's just look at some numbers. Let's look at some numbers of Tennessee so that you better understand what we're talking about. 94% of property owners and 98% of renters did not have electricity in the Tennessee Valley. Now hear that. Most people were still using some kind of lamp with kerosene or coal oil. They did not have electricity, which means they have no modern appliances. They're doing their laundry by hand. Their cooking may be over a wood stove or a gas stove of some kind. 30% of property owners and 41% had no toilets. Yeah, they're still using outhouses. That old concept of the rural out, it was a real thing. I even remember going to my grandparents' church back in the day. They still had an outhouse, and I'm not that old. They just had never brought, when that church was built, it didn't have plumbing. There are still people who can tell you when they first got electricity in their house. Maybe when all this is over, you sit down with some of your older folks at church or your grandparents or great-grandparents and talk about, do they remember when they got electricity, or were they born in a house that had electricity? The house that my grandparents had, they had to figure out where to put a bathroom later in its history. And again, it didn't have electricity. So what we're trying to do is take this rural farm life and bring it into the modern world. 65% of property owners, 73% of renters had to go 300 yards to get water. They didn't have running water in the house. They had a well. Guys, that's still not as uncommon as you might think. There are still well houses in some rural areas. There's still wells on property because that's where people got their water. 8% of property owners, 3% of tenants owned radios. So again, how do you get your message out if the people aren't hearing what you've got to say? Again, usually battery operated. 39% of property owners, 23% of renters. They did have a record player, right? It was hand cranked. They cranked it up and it played. And when it ran down, they cranked it again. It wasn't a plug-in. 50% of property owners, 25% read the newspaper. Now, some of that is literacy rates and some of that is the cost. And again, you could buy a newspaper and spread that around. 26% of property owners and 16% of tenants owned automobiles. People didn't have cars. Guys, it's still rural. I still had people where I went to church tell me that they would be playing in the yard and they would hear a car coming down the road and they would run to the edge and stand at the fence to see what kind of car. It was that exciting for them because cars were still that scarce in the South. 7% of property owners and 4% own trucks. We think of the pickup truck being a very Southern thing. Well, that's only a later idea once cars become a part of their lifestyle. And this, guys, everywhere where you see water used to be a valley, and someone owned that land. There were farms there. There were churches. There were cemeteries. All that has to be moved when they decide to back up the river and to control the water. Now, today, this creates your city. Your city is Hendersonville, city by the lake. There was no lake there in the 30s and not till the 40s. There just wasn't a lake. They were valleys. You could drive from your city to Mount Juliet. Today, you can't go because there's a lake there. You have to go all the way to Nashville and around, or Gallatin and around. There's no bridge, right? So look at this picture. You see the dam there in the bottom area. It has backed up and flooded these valleys. Well, where did those people go? Well, the government moved them. The government took them other places, just like we see with the Smoky Mountains National Park when they're building it. But still, underneath there are still some semblances of civilization. And what does it make? It makes these. We're going to use steam. Those lakes are going to make it possible to bring barges of coal in, or to send coal by train. That's going to put coal miners to work, right, in rural Appalachia, to burn, to make steam, to turn the turbines that make the electricity. In Gallatin today, there's the steam plant. That's what provided most likely your electricity today. You're going to have a series of locks. Now, some of you live and you see roads in our area called Lock 3 or Lock 4. That meant that road went down to where there was a lock to raise boats and raise these barges as they went through the river. Some of them now, because of the dams, are actually underwater. And they're not there anymore. So when you go out to the end of these roads called Lock 3 or Lock 4, there's no lock there anymore. But there was originally to let traffic go up and down the river. They've now backed the river up. It's created lakes. It's much easier for those things to happen. Now, what happens when TVA comes to town? What do you do with your private companies? Well, many of them sold out to the government. So, again, you don't want to put them out of business in a depression. So here is the idea that you can buy your electricity from the government. That's a new concept. All of you did that today. Unless your house runs on solar power or some kind of private generator, you bought your electricity from the government. You bought your water from the government. You may have even gotten your cable from a company that's sanctioned by the government. We don't think about that today, but this was a new concept. All right. Does this mean the government has a monopoly? On these things. Can the government have a monopoly? I want you to look at that second cartoon for just a moment. Notice it says TVA there in the foreground, but you see private industry over there at the bottom worried. What happens when the big federal government gets involved in private industry? Does it make it able to be competitive? Notice here is FDR. He starts with TVA, and then he sees other projects that create power, that create communities, that go country. What if the government makes all of our electricity? What if it runs the railroads? What if it controls the telephone? I mean, again, that was the socialist ideas that the populists had wanted, that the government would control those means of productions, and Europe was looking at those ideas. Today we worry about maybe in certain administrations going to socialist. Well, this is where we start really having that debate. I want you to all notice one other thing about this cartoon. Look at FDR. He's standing. He's standing. Again, look at how many ways and times that he is portrayed, and he is portrayed by the press as a normal, healthy man. Here he is standing ready to walk out across America. Well, what do we really know about him? That would have been impossible. That would have been physically impossible for him to do. But that is how he's going to be portrayed because we need that strong sense of him as leader. So look at this. Look at how much industrialization goes into this picture. Steel, copper, other metals, forging, electricity being made, concrete. I mean, this is going to put people to work. This is a hydroelectric dam. So what about your banks? How do we make sure this never happens again? We're getting you some relief, right? We're recovering the country. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Well, here we are into reform, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is where we're going to pick it up when we meet next. We're going to talk about how they reformed things. I've got a fun video for you that we'll watch together next time we Zoom. But I think we'll stop it here today, and we've given you quite a bit to think about. Read your book. Be ready for class on Tuesday, and I look forward to seeing you as we continue and complete the New Deal. Guys, have a great day.